but the idea was consistent with his philosophy. This reminds me that someone has said that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given enough time, becomes people. And of course, that is exactly what evolutionists do believe. According to evolution theory, then, disorder spontaneously generated order. Complexity arose from simplicity. Chaos created the cosmos, all by a process of self-transformation. According to this theory, the universe is an isolated system which began in a state of disorder and spontaneously transformed itself into the present highly ordered and complex universe. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that idea, that notion, is directly contradicted by the second law of thermodynamics. According to this law of science, an isolated system, that is, a system on which no work is being performed by an outside agency, and a system into which no energy is being brought in from the outside, can only become more disordered with time, never more ordered. Such a system will constantly become more random, more disorderly. That is a natural law of this universe. Flying directly in the face of this natural law, evolutionists persist in believing that this universe is an isolated system which started in a state of disorder and transformed itself into a highly ordered and complex state. Creation scientists reject this totally anti-scientific notion. Furthermore, they asked, by what means of tortured logic can one assume that the very same processes and principles which are now leading towards destruction of this universe could also have been responsible for its origin in the first place? To believe that this universe created itself naturally is irrational and unscientific. And if it could not have created itself naturally, then it had to be created supernaturally. If evolutionists really believe in science, they would abandon their faith in the God of evolution. Now let us consider the laws of probability, also a fundamental law of science. Every living cell on this earth, whether bacterial or human, is indescribably complex, marvelously coordinated in time and space, and exhibits purposefulness in every detail of its structure and function. The human body has about 30 trillion cells of over 200 varieties, 12 billion of which are found in a 3-pound human brain. In the brain, there are at least 120 trillion connections, the most incredibly complex arrangement of matter in the universe. The evolutionists would have us believe that this marvelously designed and unbelievably complex human body and millions of other equally complex plants and animals were produced through millions of random chance mistakes or mutations. Evolutionist Lauren Isley, for example, declared that man is a long chain of DNA accidents taking place over billions of years. Carl Sagan was quoted in Time magazine as saying that only through the deaths of an immense number of slightly maladapted organisms are we, brains and all, here today. Creation scientists point out that when this notion is examined in the light of information theory and the laws of probability, that notion is simply preposterous. And we are finding an increasing number of scientists and mathematicians who, even though they are evolutionists, are saying the same thing. You just cannot generate even a single bacterial cell by such chance processes in 5 billion years, or 500 billion years as far as that's concerned, let alone the millions of complex species that now exist. Even at the molecular level, evolution is impossible. Most proteins consist of several hundred amino acids, each arranged in precise sequence. And DNA and RNA usually consist of thousands of nucleotides, also arranged in precise order. The number of different possible ways these subunits can be arranged is so incredibly astronomical that it is literally impossible for a single molecule of protein or DNA to have been generated by chance in 5 billion years. For example, Calculations by Dr. Hubert P. Yockey, based on information theory, demonstrated that the most one could get by chance in 1 billion years is one single gene sufficient to code for a protein of only 49 amino acids. Of course, that's light years short of what would be required for the most primitive cell imaginable. Well, even to have the remotest chance of getting life started, we would have to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different protein molecules and billions of tons each of hundreds, if not thousands, of different DNA and RNA molecules. Here in my hand, I have a newspaper article published August the 14th, 1981 in the Daily Express of London. The headlines say, "When two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reach an amazing conclusion, there must be a God." Who are these two atheists, or I should say ex-atheists? None other than the famous British astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle and Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe, a mathematician and astronomer. These two scientists, working independently, calculated the mathematical probability of life starting spontaneously by some evolutionary process, taking the entire universe into account. They were astounded. They couldn't believe their results. The probability turned out to be 0, nil. They each then concluded that life had to be created and therefore there must be a God. Now, how could anyone ignore these conclusions, reached no less than by these two hard-nosed atheists, or I should say, again, ex-atheists? Ladies and gentlemen, based on the proved principles of chemical thermodynamics and kinetics, information theory, and the laws of probability, we can say that a mechanistic evolutionary origin of life is simply impossible. Earlier, I referred to evolution as the fish to Gish theory. Now, in this context, I think we should call it the too little to do little theory of evolution. What about the fossil record? In that record, do we find gradual change from simple to complex demanded by evolution? Are museums overflowing with vast numbers of the transitional forms that should have been found if evolution is true? Well, our museums do contain millions of fossils, including those of over 250,000 different species. The available fossil record is much more than adequate to document evolution if true. However, what we find in the fossil record is not what is predicted based on evolution. We have not found what we were told to look for ever since Darwin. The missing links are still missing. What we do find is a sudden explosive appearance of a great variety of highly complex forms of life for which we have never found ancestors. Furthermore, we find that each basic type of plant and animal has appeared fully formed with no evidence of gradual change. No evidence of intermediate or transitional forms are found. This is precisely the evidence predicted on the basis of creation. Let us hear what some evolutionists have admitted about the fossil record. Dr. Corner, a Cambridge botanist, stated in a book published in 1961 that, quote, "Much evidence can be adduced in favor of evolution, but I still think that to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of creation." In an article published in the journal Evolution in 1974, Dr. David Kitts of the University of Oklahoma said, quote, "Despite the bright promise that paleontology, that is the fossil record, provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them." End of quote. But what about Lucy, an ape that Donald Johanson claims walked upright, just like man, and therefore, he says, should be placed at the base of the human family, an intermediate between ape and man? Since Johanson describes this creature as totally ape from the neck up, the only basis for the idea that this creature was a link between man and ape is the notion that it did walk upright. But did it really walk upright, like you and I? Johanson says that his Lucy is the earliest and most primitive of a group of creatures whose scientific name is Australopithecus. but studies on supposedly more recent forms of Australopithecus by Lord Zuckerman, a famous British anatomist, and by Dr. Charles Oxnard, a professor at the University of Southern California, convinced them that these creatures did not walk upright like man and that they were not intermediate between ape and man. In fact, in his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, published in 1970, Lord Zuckerman states that if man evolved from an ape-like creature, he didn't leave a trace of that evolution in the fossil record. And while we're on this subject, we should remind ourselves of the famous Piltdown man that stood for nearly 50 years as a human ancestor until shown to be a hoax, constructed from a modern ape's jaw and a modern human skull. And Nebraska man, another creature hailed as an evolutionary ancestor of man that turned out to be nothing more than a pig's tooth. Finally, evolutionists believe that some hairy, four-legged mammal that may have resembled a pig, cow, or buffalo evolved into whales, dolphins, and other marine mammals. One of our creation scientists, Luther Sunderland, has attempted to visualize what these intermediates may have looked like. We see that on the screen. Now, my challenge to Dr. Doolittle and to all other evolutionists is this: if you don't like these suggestions, what are yours? When we come right down to any concrete case like this example, we see that the whole idea of evolution is absurd. Spatial creation is far more credible, far more reasonable. Dr. Shapley gave us two choices: in the beginning God, or in the beginning hydrogen. I say that the overwhelming mass of the scientific evidence demands in the beginning God. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Thank you, Dr. Gish. And now, with his rebuttal, Dr. Doolittle.
Dr. Gish continues with more of his illogical logic. If it can't be explained right now, then obviously if it can't be explained by natural causes, it must be supernatural. I have two rebuffs to this to start with. The first place, if it has to be supernatural, why only the Christian one? Why not all these non-Christian explanations that have been with us for centuries? It always seems to be that it only has to be his supernatural one. Secondly, just because we can't explain something now doesn't mean we won't be able to explain it in the future. Look at the last 100 years. We have discovered the world of the very small, the world of the very large. We've discovered viruses, bacteria, all these things. The whole notion of DNA and how it gets together in its self-assembly process is something we've only been on to for about 30 years now. So I think that there's no doubt that we will explain all this, any of the questions that he's raised, to everyone's satisfaction eventually. The question is whether we have to put everything on hold and go through a lot of mumbo-jumbo in the interim. Let me take some specifics. His thermodynamic one. Now, Dr. Gish raises this thermodynamic argument no matter where he goes. I'd like to take a page from his book and read from his own fellows. I'm reading now from Dr. J.A. Kramer, professor of physics at Wheaton, Illinois College, an acknowledged creationist. This isn't an evolutionist now. This is one of you, creationist. He says, if we are to believe that general evolution contradicts the second law, we must also conclude that all living organisms continually violate the law. He suggests that creationists stick to things that they are more competent in. Now, with regard to this fellow Yockey and his paper, Dr. Gish raised this last year in a debate with me. I hadn't read the paper before. This time I've read it. It is shot through with errors and misassumptions. In fact, it is, as I've explained to Dr. Gish many times, the earliest proteins were undoubtedly very simple and small. They weren't the size of the ones that they always take for their examples. They got bigger by a process of gene duplication, biochemical Xerox I usually refer to it as. They were inefficient at the beginning. They got better. There's been plenty of time. That's why the age of the Earth is so important to the evolutionary argument. I'm still waiting to hear this evening when Dr. Gish tells us how old, in his view, the Earth is. Now, besides these things, and when it comes to this business about thermodynamics, probability, and so on, I have to say that either Dr. Gish understands, he refuses to understand, or he can't understand, and it's not for me to decide which tonight. Now, the thing that I am most concerned about here in this business about what view should pertain if you in fact find that evolution is offensive to your religion, To me, that is a problem. I understand that you could have something very near and dear to you. I mean, after all, who wants to tell a child that Santa Claus doesn't exist or something of that sort? I can understand that it would be very sensitive if you believed a certain thing and you found your daughter or son being taught something differently in school. Now, I would reiterate that evolution is a scientific concept. It is completely secular. It has nothing to do with religion. It doesn't say anything about what you want to believe in that regard. Now, the analogy I would make is, should we not teach, for example, in the public schools, hygiene? Suppose we should say that we should not say, as we know, that germs cause disease. The reason we shouldn't say that germs cause disease, viruses, bacteria, etc., is because some religions don't accept that. Should we therefore say we have to give equal time to people who don't believe that? It would be absurd. Should we teach or not teach that the earth is a globe? There are people, mostly on religious grounds, more fundamental than these people here, I would tell you, that believe the earth is flat. There are still flat earthers, and they find it in their rendering of the Bible where they say that the four corners of the earth are referred to there. You don't find four corners when you have a sphere. Should we not teach that just because some religions don't? No, I say keep religions separate. Now I'd like to get on to this business that I missed in my main rendition about the ape-like ancestor in man, because this is in fact what it has all now gets people most aroused. Jerry Falwell, for example, in that quote I started to read earlier, said he wouldn't mind if in fact the earth were 100 million years old, as long as nobody starts to claim that man came from an ancestor that resembled apes. Now, of course, man did come from an ancestor that resembled apes, and we can prove it in many different ways. There are no gaps in the molecular fossil record. There's a complete set of transitional forms. And I can make this point, I think, very clearly to you. If you were going to go in and have a transplant, kidney, for example, you know that you go to the doctor, if you're a person these days who is any sort of current and would care about your health, and you had to have a transplant, you would certainly prefer to have that from an identical twin. If you don't have an identical twin, the doctor would say, well, do you have a fraternal twin? The reason is that your molecules, your molecular constitution is more similar when you are, in fact, coming from either an egg or an egg fertilized in the same womb. Or if you can't have that, a sibling of any sort would do, or a parent. And then after that, maybe a first cousin. Well, everybody appreciates that as you get further and further away in ancestry, the molecules become more different. Well, the same picture emerges when you compare all the molecules.
Dr. Doolittle, but your time is up.
Oh.
And now with his rebuttal, Dr. Dwayne Gish.
Well, unfortunately, Dr. Doolittle wasted much of his time talking about the situation in the Livermore School District. What that teacher did, he used books which included reference to the Bible and material like that, which we have no intention of putting in the public schools. As a matter of fact, the material that we have prepared for public schools have been very carefully edited to remove any references to the Bible or religious literature of any kind. So all of that discussion had nothing to do with the discussion this evening. As a matter of fact, this is supposed to be a debate on the scientific evidence related to origins, you see, creation and evolution, not what some teacher may have done in Livermore, California. Now, I'm surprised that Dr. Doolittle doesn't know the difference between living organisms and a dead, inanimate world, or our universe. You see, of course we can exist, living things can exist, because we are living organisms. We have marvelous machinery. We can take in food, and we can use that food, you see. But our universe was an isolated system. You didn't bring anything into the universe, you see. You didn't have any means like that. Let me give you another example. You know that automobiles don't usually run uphill. They usually run downhill. Well, you can get an automobile to go uphill, but you don't just bring in a can of gasoline and pour the gasoline over the car and light a match. That won't make it go uphill. It just goes up in smoke. What do you do if you want to get that car to go uphill? You have to take the gasoline, which is chemical energy, put it in your gas tank, which is fed into the motor. What does the motor do? It converts that chemical energy into mechanical energy. Now the car will go uphill. So you have to have an energy conversion machine. And of course you have to have somebody driving the automobile. If you don't have anybody driving the automobile, it doesn't go uphill, runs off into the ditch. You see, you have to satisfy certain conditions. You have to have an energy conversion machine and a proper control. On the hypothetical primordial Earth, you did not have an energy conversion machine. You had no control system. And the idea that life could have spontaneously generated itself, contrary to the second law of thermodynamics, is not science, ladies and gentlemen. That is blind faith. Now, Dr. Doolittle has mentioned the age of the Earth. Now, concerning the age of the Earth, of course, evolutionists have no choice. They must believe in a very old Earth, since evolution demands an immensity of time. This debate is not about the time of origins, however, but about the how of origins. These are separate questions. In fact, some creationists agree with Dr. Doolittle that things seem quite old, while other creationists cite a large number of physical time clocks that indicate that the solar system and the universe must be quite young. Yet both groups of scientists agree that the scientific data demands creation. Dr. Doolittle has referred to the coalified wood. How could you date wood with uranium? The uranium is an intrusion into the coalified wood. The uranium is there, no problem. He mentions these Paluxy River tracks. Ladies and gentlemen, there were a few tracks carved during the Depression. When they ran out of tracks, didn't have any more to sell, they carved a few. But that doesn't mean that the tracks that have been uncovered in recent years in under a bank and so forth, they can't be carved. These aren't carved, these are genuine tracks. And so they are valid evidences there for at least the coexistence of man tracks with dinosaur tracks. And he referred to a statement by Dr. Parker. I know Dr. Parker personally, he's my colleague. Dr. Parker, for a while after he became a Christian, was an evolutionist. It wasn't that, but his pursuit of the scientific evidence convinced him as a scientist that evolution cannot be true and that creation is a better explanation. Now, Dr. Doolittle has referred to meteorites and the moon, and you always get the right age. He didn't mention the fact that when they dated the moon rock, they got ages of all kinds, from almost a few thousand to many multiplied billions of years. They simply selected the date that had to be right, which had to be 4.6, you see, 4.6 billion. The trouble with these dating systems, there's too much picking and choosing. That's what I say about it. It's simply not a scientific method. But again, I reiterate, that is not the question here tonight. How did things come about, creation or evolution? I say the scientific evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. And now, with his summary, Dr. Doolittle.
Still no age of the Earth in numbers there. I think that I don't know whether NASA's been lying to the president. Maybe the president ought to call up NASA and say, how old are those moon rocks? All right, summation. All living things, as we know them today, I would contend, are related through an enormous family tree. You through your parents, your grandparents, your great-parents, and as reprehensible as it may seem to you, all the way back to bacteria. You have enzymes floating around in your system that can be shown unequivocally to have amino acid sequences that resemble those that occur in bacteria, that could not possibly come about by chance in any possible way. In contrast, I find creation science is a pseudoscience. It distorts, it misrepresents, we've seen it tonight, it ignores facts, it's based on a narrow religious dogmatism. To put it in the science classroom, I believe, is to handicap America. It's to cheat our children. For only by an understanding of the logic of evolution are we going to understand the problems that we face as a civilization today. Mankind, if he doesn't understand evolution, cannot understand ecology. He cannot understand how we're drowning in this earth from an overpopulation and overexploitation of resources. To ignore these facts, I would contend, is to live a life of pretense and will certainly lead us on the road down to a dinosaur-like extinction. Therefore, I naturally favor the view of evolution. I know that it is the only explanation for our being here tonight.
Thank you. And now Dr. Gish with his summary.
Ladies and gentlemen, 3 or 4 centuries ago, the notion that the sun and other planets revolved around the earth was the dogma of the scientific establishment. And Galileo faced determined opposition from fellow astronomers when he suggested otherwise. Louis Pasteur and others, about a century ago, overturned the established dogma of centuries when they showed that living things never arise spontaneously from dead matter. Today, even though thousands of scientists are creationists and the number is growing rapidly, the notion of evolution remains a stifling dogma. Evolutionists seek to smother all challenges from within or without the scientific and educational establishments, concealing the fallacies and weaknesses of the theory and adamantly opposing a hearing for the scientific case for creation. Why is this so? Certainly not because the notion of evolution is science and the concept of creation is religion. I can think of two possibilities. First, it may be that evolutionists consider that our students are too ignorant, too illiterate to be exposed to these competing ideas of origins. They must be protected from error and carefully indoctrinated in correct ideas by those who consider themselves to be the intellectual elite, the sole possessors of truth. Secondly, having engendered this fragile tower of hypotheses piled on hypotheses where fact and fiction intermingle in an inextricable confusion, it may be that evolutionists are aware of the fact that the notion of evolution will fare badly if exposed to an open and determined challenge from creation scientists, and that if this is done, the majority of our students will accept creation as the better of the two concepts of origins. Whatever may be the case, it is urgent that our students be exposed to all of the evidence, all of the arguments on each side of this question, so that these two alternative concepts of origins, creation and evolution, can compete freely in the marketplace of ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Russell Doolittle of the University of California, San Diego, and Dr. Dwayne Gish of the Institute for Creation Research, San Diego, for being with us tonight for this most important debate. You have just witnessed a 1-hour nationally televised debate on one of the most important controversies of our time: scientific creation versus evolution. No 1-hour debate on such an important and involved topic could be complete. Our purpose is to whet your appetite, to encourage you to investigate the subject at greater length for yourself, in your personal reading, in your research, in school, at the library. And to help you do that and to assist you in remembering what you've heard in this debate, I would like to offer you a full transcript of this debate between Dr. Doolittle and Dr. Gish. We'll mail it to you free if you will simply dial the toll-free number now on your screen. Please include your name, address, and proper zip code. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope this debate has proved beneficial to you. It certainly has to me. I'm Jerry Falwell. Thank you for watching, and good night.
The preceding program has been paid for by the Old Time Gospel Hour in Lynchburg, Virginia. To receive a complimentary transcript of this evening's debate, simply write to Jerry Falwell, Lynchburg, Virginia, 24514. Again, that address is Jerry Falwell, Lynchburg, Virginia, 24514. Be sure to include your name, address, and proper zip code. Now, this is John Corrigan, thanking you for watching this special program. Remember to watch the Old Time Gospel Hour weekly in your area.